Hello, everyone, and welcome to my session on St Paul's Lent course on heroes of the faith. And following what Jenny Irving said last week on whether these people are heroes or hearers of the faith, I thought I'd describe Pauli Murray both as a hero and a hero of the faith. And as you can see from that title slide, Pauli Murray was an activist, lawyer, a scholar, a poet, and a priest. And I'm very excited to introduce you to all those aspects of their identity this morning. So, Pauli Murray was born on November the 20th, 1910, in Baltimore, in the US state of Maryland, and died in Pittsburgh, in Pennsylvania, in 1985. In between, Pauli Murray lived an active and varied life that saw them live out her faith as an activist lawyer for African American and women's rights. She also lived out her faith in following her calling and being ordained a priest in the Episcopal Church, that is the Anglican denomination in the United States. And before I go any further, I should mention that for reasons that I'll go into, I will sometimes say she and her to describe Pauli Murray, and sometimes they. As I say, I'll explain why that is in due course. So, Pauli Murray's early life. She was born with the name Anna Pauline Murray in 1910, and her early life was very difficult. Her mum, Agnes, died very suddenly when Pauli was 3. She suddenly collapsed, dropped down dead of a cerebral hemorrhage on the stairs, and Pauli's father struggled to cope. Pauli was sent to live with their aunt, Pauline Fitzgerald, where she regularly attended St. Titus's Episcopal Church, which formed the beginning of her particular connection to that form of Christianity. When she was 12, in 1922, Pauli's father, William, was admitted to a mental institution called the Crownsville State Hospital for the Negro Insane. A reminder that all facilities in the United States were segregated at this point. Her father was offered no adequate treatment. The next year, he was taunted by a staff member who used racial epithets, dragged him into a basement, and in an altercation, bludgeoned him to death with a baseball bat. Pauli travelled to the funeral alone and later described seeing him in the open casket, and I quote, "His skull was split open like a melon and sewed together loosely with jagged stitches." She'd already developed a keen sense of the discrimination she faced because of her identity as a Black person. She never went to the cinema because that would mean having to sit in segregated balcony seating. And she avoided public transport wherever possible because that also was segregated. When Pauli Murray came to sort of where to study for university, she desperately wanted to attend Columbia University in New York City, but they didn't accept women. She then tried to apply to their related institution, Barnard College, which was designed for women, but there was no way she could pay the expensive fees. She was then accepted to study English at Hunter College, also in New York, for free. But she had to get her grades in order first because she'd been living in North Carolina with her aunt. And that meant she'd only had education up to the equivalent of year 11 and not every subject that they needed in order to be accepted to Hunter College. So that meant spending 2 years at a secondary school in New York. In a school of 4,000 pupils, Pauli was the only African American. So, by the age of 18, Pauli had been orphaned and had already gained experience of the racism and sexism and how the two were connected when they came to attacking their identity. She had already also begun a lifelong journey of Christian discipleship. There were 2 great themes that had already dominated Pauli's early life and would continue to dominate their life in the years ahead. The first was Pauli and race. Pauli was determined to use their intellect to help others, and so Pauli wanted to become a lawyer, a civil rights lawyer. Pauli applied to study law at the University of North Carolina, near where her aunt lived and where other distant relatives had attended. but was told, members of your race aren't admitted to the university. Whilst Pauli was trying to find somewhere to study law, Pauli spent time in prison for disorderly conduct. And the situation was this: Pauli and a friend were on a bus between New York and North Carolina. They sat near the front, not in the seats reserved for Black people. Without any premeditation, they both refused to move when the driver asked them to. This led to both of them being arrested for disorderly behaviour, and Pauli spent several days in prison. It's worth pointing out that this was in the year 1940, and that's a full 15 years before the same treatment was inflicted on Rosa Parks and the boycott of buses that followed. Pauli was eventually accepted to study law at Howard University. That's an institution specifically designed to educate Black people. And Pauli graduated top of the class. Having graduated, Pauli was struggling to find work as a lawyer, but in the year 1948, Pauli was approached by the Women's Division of the US Methodist Church, asking for help in explaining how their churches could be anti-discrimination. The result of this was Pauli writing a 746-page long book called States Laws on Race and Colour. You can see a picture of it there. This book contained various ways explaining how widespread, varied, and absurd segregation law was in the United States. This book ended up being called the Bible of the Civil Rights Movement and was used by lawyers in numerous court cases challenging legal discrimination, beginning with the court case Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. And as a result of that court case and many others that followed, it was declared that separate but equal facilities were in fact against the US Constitution because they were neither truly separate nor in any way equal. So, to summarize, Pauli Murray was a hugely important legal activist and a scholar. Pauli played a huge part in overturning legal discrimination against Black people in the United States. Pauli heard the call of anti-racism in her faith and acted using her God-given gifts of intellect and ability. And you can see there a photo from around the time that Pauli was a law student, so on their way to becoming a real champion of the law in defense of Black people. The other great theme of Pauli's life and their work against discrimination was gender. And Pauli also acted to resist discrimination that was based on gender. Murray called this legal discrimination Jane Crow, i.e. it was the equivalent of the Jim Crow laws that discriminated on the basis of race. Murray had great experience of this alongside discrimination based on her skin. She was the only female student in her class at law school, and on her first day studying law, her tutor said he didn't understand why women would want to study law at all. Pauli was livid, and it was one of the reasons that she was inspired to graduate top of her class as a way of demonstrating that female women had the ability to be good lawyers and good legal scholars. Because Pauli graduated at the top of her class, that would normally have meant an automatic invitation to study further at Harvard University. However, this invitation was not sent out because Pauli was female. Pauli's response shows something of her fighting spirit. Gentlemen, I would gladly change my sex to meet your requirements, but since the way to such a change has not been revealed to me, I have no recourse but to appeal to you to change your minds on this subject. Are you to tell me that one is as difficult as the other? So you can see there not only a well thought through answer, but an answer rooted in the fundamental idea of a fairness and equality. As a lawyer, Pauli did important work in this area of discrimination, as well as against racial discrimination. Pauli was the author of an important article in a law journal that was later used to argue before the US Supreme Court that women, as well as Black people, shouldn't suffer discrimination that was supposedly rooted in the United States Constitution. Pauli was a co-founder of the National Organization for Women and successfully argued herself for a court case that women were capable of serving on juries, a reminder of just how much discrimination women faced at that time. In the mid-1970s, Pauli suddenly left a job teaching law at a university to start training to be an Episcopal priest. As a reminder, Episcopal is the name for the Anglican Church in the United States. At this point, when Pauli had become training, the rules didn't even allow for the Episcopal Church to ordain a woman. However, the rules changed while Pauli trained, and in 1977, she became the first African American woman ever ordained as an Episcopal priest. And you can see a picture of that time there on the left with her in her vestments. Pauli first presided at a communion service at a chapel in North Carolina, where her enslaved grandmother had been baptized. So there's a sign of how much had changed, both in Pauli's lifetime and in the family history of her own life. Pauli was now nearly 70 when she was ordained and spent the last 8 years of her life as a guest preacher and ministering to the sick in Washington, D.C. Pauli Murray died in 1985, aged 74, and you can see a picture from towards the end of their life there, with her in her dog collar and with a great big smile, presumably thinking about their achievements. Despite all this work against gender discrimination, Murray had a very complicated relationship with gender. Pauli had a very brief marriage to a man when she was young. She and the husband were both 20, and Murray almost immediately described this as a dreadful mistake. They never saw each other again after a few months, and later the marriage was annulled. Pauli Murray's longest relationship was with a woman called Irene Barlow, and they were together for 25 years until, that is, Irene Barlow died. However, Pauli refused to describe this as a lesbian relationship, sometimes saying that she felt more male than female, and therefore in her eyes she wasn't a woman who loved a woman. Murray sometimes considered herself a hermaphrodite, and sometimes more male than female. She never called herself Anna or Pauline. As you might recall, she was born with the name Anna Pauline Murray. But after her teens, she used Pauli instead, as a name that wasn't specifically linked to a gender in other people's minds. And yet in almost all their correspondence, Pauli referred to herself and her ideas. So this is a reminder that human lives can be very complicated things, and on the specific area of gender identity, these sorts of struggles aren't quite as new as we might think. Pauli Murray was wrestling with this in the 1940s and the 1950s and beyond. And so this is not just a new phenomenon. And so, to close, for me, Pauli Murray is both a hero and a hero of the faith. I think this is because Pauli Murray stood up for the rights of the oppressed, using God-given intellect and determination to make a real difference, challenging and changing the law. I think that Pauli followed a calling and lived it out, even to the point of becoming ordained late in life, a reminder that to follow God's calling can take you to new and surprising places. And Pauli demonstrated faithfulness throughout a complex and challenging life. She had a very rough start as a young child, and then throughout her life wrestled with issues of mental health and her own sense of identity. I also think Pauli Murray is a hero because they expanded the vision of what a Christian leader and a Christian life looks like. And it's a challenge to us to reflect on what a Christian identity is and how it is the basis of everything else that we are as people. And I thought I would close with a verse from Galatians, a verse that I think sums up very well the struggles that Pauli Murray fought in and participated in, both personally and in her professional life. As many of you as were baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male or female. For all of you are one in Christ Jesus. Amen.